What if I told you that one of Oregon's most successful orchards began with a pile of broken beehives everyone else wanted to burn? When 18-year-old Ethan Mercer spent months collecting abandoned hive boxes from farms across Rogue Valley, people laughed and called him crazy. But hidden inside his grandfather's final notebook was an idea that would bring bees back to dying orchards, revive an entire valley's harvest, and prove that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones the world throws away first. Early spring settled gently across Oregon's Rogue Valley beneath a pale gray sky. Cold winds carried the scent of damp earth, wildflowers, and fresh pear blossoms after weeks of soft Pacific rain. Ethan Mercer had grown up believing that the smallest creatures often carried the greatest responsibilities. At 18 years old, he stood just over 6 feet tall with the lean but resilient build of someone raised on a working farm instead of inside classrooms. Years of lifting hay bales, repairing fences, pruning fruit trees, and hauling irrigation pipes had quietly strengthened his shoulders without giving him the appearance of an athlete. His thick, dark brown hair usually fell untidily across his forehead, no matter how often he pushed it back beneath an old canvas cap. Sharp, gray-blue eyes constantly studied details most people overlooked, while a light dusting of freckles remained across his cheeks from endless springs spent beneath Oregon's unpredictable skies. His hands were rough long before adulthood, crossed by countless tiny scars left by pruning knives, splintered orchard ladders, rusted fencing wire, and beekeeping tools he had only recently begun collecting. Friends sometimes joked that Ethan listened more than he spoke. They were right. He disliked arguments because he believed answers appeared only after careful observation. That quiet habit sometimes made people mistake him for uncertainty when, in reality, he simply refused to speak before understanding the problem completely. The Mercer family had grown pears and apples in Rogue Valley for nearly 70 years. Their orchard covered almost 50 acres of gently rolling hills where rows of Anjou pears, Bartlett pears, Honeycrisp apples, and Gala apples stretched toward distant forests. Ethan's father, David Mercer, 51 years old, possessed the broad shoulders and weathered face of a lifelong orchard farmer. Thick black hair had begun surrendering to silver above his ears, while a neatly trimmed beard framed a square jaw hardened by decades of unpredictable harvests. His deep hazel eyes carried quiet kindness, but years of fluctuating fruit prices and worsening pollinator shortages had also taught him caution. David rarely dismissed new ideas outright, though experience made him trust proven methods more than hopeful experiments. Ethan respected his father deeply because David had never measured success by money alone. He believed a farmer's true wealth rested in the health of the land left behind for the next generation. Yet, even David struggled to understand his son's newest obsession. It began shortly after winter loosened its grip on the valley. Instead of preparing for college applications like many classmates or applying for seasonal work at larger commercial orchards, Ethan started driving his grandfather's faded flatbed truck from one farm to another, asking a strange question. "Do you have any old beehives you're planning to throw away?" Most farmers laughed before answering yes. Behind aging barns sat collapsing hive boxes blackened by rain, invaded by wax moths, warped by years of neglect, or abandoned after entire colonies had mysteriously disappeared. Some families had once kept dozens of hives before disease, parasites, or simple discouragement convinced them never to try again. Ethan accepted every damaged hive with the same quiet gratitude. Within 2 months, more than 50 abandoned hive boxes stood arranged in careful rows behind the Mercer's equipment shed. Neighbors passing along the county road slowed their trucks to stare. Some smiled. Others shook their heads. One afternoon, Harold Benson, an older pear grower whose family owned one of the valley's largest orchards, leaned against the fence watching Ethan unload another trailer filled with broken hive equipment. Harold, 63 years old, stood nearly 6 feet 3 with a heavy farmer's frame built through decades of lifting orchard bins and operating tractors. His thick white beard rested neatly across his broad jaw, while thoughtful brown eyes revealed more curiosity than cruelty. Years of difficult harvests had taught Harold to respect hard work, but not every unusual idea deserved belief. "What exactly are you planning to build?" he finally asked. Ethan smiled while stacking another weathered hive box. "I'm still figuring that out." Harold laughed. "You've been saying that for weeks." "I know. You'll need more than rotten wood if you plan on keeping bees. Ethan simply nodded. I probably will. Harold drove away, still unconvinced. That evening, Ethan's mother watched him through the kitchen window while preparing dinner. Laura Mercer, 48 years old, possessed shoulder-length auburn hair usually tied loosely behind her neck, gentle green eyes, and a warm smile that made almost anyone feel welcome inside the Mercer farmhouse. Before marrying David, she had worked as an elementary school teacher, and traces of that patient kindness remained visible in everything she did. She understood her son's quiet personality better than most people because she knew silence often hid careful thinking rather than uncertainty. She placed a bowl of stew before Ethan. Your father says you've collected enough old boxes to fill another barn. Ethan smiled faintly. I know. Laura stirred her tea. Would you tell me what you're looking for? He hesitated. I don't think I'm looking for boxes. She looked at him curiously. What then? I'm looking for what they used to hold. Laura said nothing else. She recognized the same thoughtful expression Ethan's grandfather used to wear whenever an unusual idea first took root. Several days later, heavy rain forced Ethan to move old equipment from his late grandfather's workshop before the roof leaked again. Dust floated through narrow beams of pale afternoon light. Rusted smokers rested beside cracked honey extractors. Broken hive tools hung from wooden pegs exactly where they had been left years earlier. Along the back wall stood a weathered cedar cabinet Ethan remembered opening as a child whenever his grandfather allowed him to help clean the workshop. Inside rested dozens of leather-bound notebooks. Most contained flowering calendars, weather observations, queen replacement dates, honey harvest records, hand-drawn maps showing where wild blackberry, clover, maple, and Oregon grape bloomed throughout the valley each season. His grandfather had never attended college, yet every page resembled the field journal of a professional ecologist. Hours passed unnoticed. Finally, Ethan reached the last notebook. Almost every remaining page stood blank. Only the final page carried one carefully written sentence in faded pencil. Healthy orchards don't begin with trees, they begin with healthy bees. He read the sentence once, then again. Outside, gentle rain tapped softly against the workshop roof while distant pear trees swayed beneath the cool spring wind. Most people would have dismissed the words as simple farming wisdom. Ethan did not. He remembered something few growers still talked about. When he was a little boy, the orchards had always sounded different. The air had hummed. Wild bees filled every spring morning. Now the blossoms bloomed in strange silence. For the next 3 weeks, Ethan studied everything he could find. Scientific papers, extension office reports, old university publications, pollinator surveys, maps showing shrinking native bee populations across Oregon. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that buying new commercial honeybee packages would only treat symptoms rather than solve the deeper problem. Then, just before sunrise one chilly April morning, instead of placing an order for imported honeybee colonies, Ethan climbed into his grandfather's old pickup truck. He drove toward the Oregon State Insect Conservation Center. When the conservation coordinator answered his request, Ethan spoke calmly. I heard you're relocating several native bee colonies before the construction project begins. There was a brief silence. Then he added quietly, if they're still available, I'd like to take care of every colony you can legally place. Almost 2 years passed beneath the changing skies of Rogue Valley. Spring rains gave way to warm summers, brilliant autumn harvests, and quiet winters before returning once again with blossoms covering the orchards. Every season tested Ethan Mercer in a different way, yet every challenge quietly strengthened the vision that had first begun inside his grandfather's dusty workshop. The first public attention arrived unexpectedly. One cool April morning, only a month after Ethan received permission to relocate several native bee colonies from the Oregon State Insect Conservation Center, a passing delivery driver stopped along the county road. Curious about the unusual sight, he filmed Ethan carefully transferring native bee colonies from temporary conservation boxes into the restored wooden hives that everyone else had considered firewood only months earlier. Rather than wearing expensive commercial equipment, Ethan moved slowly, speaking softly as he inspected each colony before closing every hive with remarkable care. The short video lasted less than 2 minutes. By sunset, it had spread across social media throughout Oregon. The title appeared in bold letters. The boy who thinks old beehives can save an entire valley. Thousands of comments followed. He's trying to save rotten boxes instead of growing fruit. Those wild bees won't stay. Somebody tell that kid farming isn't a fairy tale. Others insisted the teenager had simply become obsessed after spending too much time reading old beekeeping journals. Ethan opened the video only once. He closed his laptop before reaching the second page of comments. During the months spent studying native pollinators, he had discovered one lesson that mattered more than public opinion. Bees never cared whether people believed in them. They simply continued doing their work. Instead of expanding the orchard or investing in larger machinery, Ethan quietly devoted nearly every dollar he earned toward rebuilding abandoned hives. He removed rotted boards one piece at a time. He replaced damaged frames with untreated cedar. He carefully sterilized usable hive boxes using heat instead of harsh chemicals whenever possible. Every repaired hive received a handwritten identification number linked to a thick leather notebook where Ethan recorded its entire history. Colony strength, queen age, brood development, seasonal flowering periods, daily temperatures, foraging distances, survival rates. His records slowly became thicker than the notebooks left behind by his grandfather. At the same time, Ethan transformed the orchard itself. Instead of keeping every row perfectly clean as neighboring growers preferred, he planted long strips of native wildflowers between orchard blocks. White clover, Oregon sunshine, lupin, yarrow, camas lilies, and native asters gradually replaced bare soil beneath the trees. Along irrigation ditches, he sowed flowering plants that bloomed at different times throughout the year, ensuring native pollinators always found food long after the pear blossoms disappeared. Many neighbors believed he was encouraging weeds. Only Ethan noticed something different. The orchard sounded alive again. One afternoon, another visitor arrived. Her name was Dr. Megan Holloway. 42 years old, Megan possessed a slim, athletic frame shaped by years of hiking mountain meadows and surveying wild pollinator habitats across the Pacific Northwest rather than working inside laboratories. Her shoulder-length sandy blonde hair usually escaped beneath a faded field hat, while intelligent blue-green eyes constantly moved across flowers, insects, and vegetation with quiet concentration. Sunlight had left soft freckles across her fair skin, and tiny scars marked her hands from years of collecting field samples among thorny shrubs and rocky hillsides. As a conservation entomologist working with Oregon's Native Pollinator Initiative, Megan believed healthy agriculture depended upon protecting entire ecosystems rather than managing individual species. Calm, endlessly patient, and naturally curious, she preferred asking questions before offering advice. She spent nearly 3 hours walking beside Ethan without interrupting his work. Finally, she smiled. "You aren't managing bees." Ethan looked up from his notebook. "No." She gently pointed toward the flowering strips. "The flowers support the bees. The bees support the orchard. The orchard protects the flowers." She paused. "You're rebuilding relationships." Those words stayed with Ethan long after Megan returned home. Over the following months, she visited regularly, not to direct his work, but to exchange ideas. Together, they identified native flowering plants that bloomed before and after orchard season, mapped nesting habitats for solitary bees, monitored colony health, and compared pollinator diversity throughout different sections of the valley. Still, progress remained frustratingly slow. Several native colonies abandoned their restored hives and disappeared into nearby forests. A harsh winter storm flooded 2 apiary sites. Wax moths destroyed several weakened colonies before Ethan detected the damage. One entire hive failed after its aging queen stopped laying healthy brood. Every setback earned fresh laughter from people who already believed the experiment would fail. Even Harold Benson shook his head one afternoon. Maybe the old boxes should have stayed in the burn pile. Ethan only smiled politely. Maybe. That evening he quietly repaired another damaged hive. Failure no longer discouraged him. Every collapsed colony revealed something new. Every empty hive became another lesson recorded inside his notebook. By the second spring, subtle changes began appearing across the Mercer orchard. The difference wasn't dramatic enough for passing motorists to notice. But Ethan noticed immediately. Native mason bees emerged weeks earlier than before. Bumblebee nests increased along grassy field margins. Wild honeybees visited blossoms alongside the relocated native colonies. Birdsong became noticeably louder as insect populations recovered. The orchard felt balanced again. The real surprise came during harvest. David Mercer stood silently beside the packing shed while reviewing the season's production records. He checked the numbers twice. Then a third time. Pear fruit set had increased significantly compared with neighboring orchards despite using fewer chemical treatments than ever before. Fruit quality improved. Misshapen pears declined. Pollination rates reached levels the family had not experienced in years. David slowly looked toward his son. I don't think it's only the trees getting healthier anymore. Ethan followed his father's gaze across the humming orchard where countless bees drifted between late-season wildflowers beneath soft evening sunlight. He smiled quietly. Neither answered. Neither needed to. The valley had not changed yet. But their orchard had. And for the first time, the old beehives no longer looked like forgotten junk. They looked like the beginning of something far greater than anyone had imagined. The third spring arrived beneath unusually cold skies over Oregon's Rogue Valley. Weeks of relentless rain drifted across the orchards while icy winds rolled down from the Cascade Mountains, leaving blossoms trembling beneath gray clouds that refused to break. The valley should have been humming with millions of pollinators. Instead, an unsettling silence settled between the rows of pear and apple trees. Experienced growers recognized the danger immediately. Cold rain prevented honeybees from leaving their hives. Native pollinators emerged late, and many weakened colonies never recovered after the harsh winter. Blossom after blossom opened with no insects nearby to carry pollen. Farmers walked through their orchards counting beautiful flowers that might never become fruit. David Mercer stood beside Ethan one chilly morning, watching rain drip from pear blossoms. I've never seen it this quiet, he said. Neither had Ethan. For several days he visited neighboring orchards, carrying nothing except his notebook. Everywhere he found the same problem. Commercial honeybee colonies remained clustered inside hives, conserving energy. Imported bee packages delivered earlier that spring had suffered unusually high losses after repeated cold fronts. Entire orchards bloomed almost untouched. Then Ethan returned home. The Mercer orchard sounded completely different. Thousands of gentle wings filled the cool morning air. Native mason bees emerged whenever brief patches of sunlight warmed the trees. Bumblebees moved steadily between blossoms despite temperatures that kept honeybees inactive. Wild mining bees appeared beneath flowering strips planted years earlier. Even the restored honeybee colonies remained noticeably stronger than those Ethan observed elsewhere. The orchard had become more than a collection of hives. It had become a living refuge. News spread quietly through Rogue Valley. Some neighboring growers drove over simply to listen. Others arrived carrying notebooks of their own. Harold Benson walked slowly beneath one flowering pear tree before stopping in disbelief. I can hear them, he whispered. Ethan smiled. They've been here all along. No, Harold replied softly. I mean, I can hear life. Only a few miles away, other orchards remained almost silent. Within weeks, county crop estimates predicted one of the poorest fruit sets in many years. The Mercer family orchard continued developing healthy young pears across nearly every block. The difference became impossible to ignore. Late one rainy afternoon, a university vehicle entered the gravel driveway. A woman stepped out carrying waterproof field cases instead of cameras. Her name was Dr. Olivia Carter. 50 years old, Olivia possessed a tall, slender build strengthened by decades of conducting ecological surveys across forests, meadows, and agricultural landscapes throughout the Pacific Northwest. Her silver-streaked auburn hair rested neatly beneath a weatherproof field hat, while intelligent hazel eyes constantly examined flowers, insects, and surrounding vegetation before speaking. Fine lines across her sun-weathered face reflected years spent outdoors rather than behind university desks. Calm, patient, and deeply analytical, Olivia had built her reputation as one of Oregon State University's leading entomologists by challenging assumptions only after gathering overwhelming evidence. Former students often admired her unusual habit of listening far longer than she talked. She introduced herself warmly. I visited 6 orchards this week. Ethan nodded politely. And none of them sound like yours. For the next month, Olivia and her research team visited almost every day. Rather than focusing only on honeybees, they surveyed every pollinating species they could find. They installed acoustic monitoring devices that recorded daily insect activity. They mapped flowering plants between orchard rows, measured fruit set, counted native bee nesting sites, tracked pollinator movement across different weather conditions, compared the Mercer orchard with neighboring commercial farms. The results surprised even Olivia. The restored wooden hives supported not only managed colonies, but also encouraged nearby native pollinator populations by providing a stable, pesticide-reduced environment surrounded by continuous flowering habitat. Ethan's restored apiaries functioned alongside wild nesting areas instead of replacing them. Even more remarkable, pollination never depended upon one species alone. When honeybees remained inactive during cold weather, mason bees continued working. When mason bee activity slowed, bumblebees became more active. As temperatures changed throughout the day, different pollinators naturally replaced one another. The orchard had quietly built resilience through diversity. One afternoon, Olivia closed her notebook beneath an old Bartlett pear tree. "You've done something most restoration projects never achieve." Ethan looked surprised. "I was only trying to help the bees." She smiled. "You helped an entire community." She drew several circles connected by lines. Old hives, native pollinators, wildflowers, healthy orchards, neighboring habitats. She tapped the center of the page. "This isn't simply beekeeping anymore." She carefully wrote 5 words across the top. Community Pollinator Recovery Network. Ethan studied the phrase silently. Olivia continued. "Most orchards buy replacement bees every spring. You rebuilt the conditions that allow pollinators to rebuild themselves." The research expanded quickly. Graduate students from Oregon State University spent weeks documenting nesting success, pollinator diversity, colony health, flowering schedules, and fruit production. Independent reviewers confirmed the same pattern again and again. Higher pollinator density, lower colony losses, greater biodiversity, more stable fruit set, reduced dependence upon imported commercial bee colonies, healthier surrounding ecosystems. When Olivia's paper was finally published, agricultural journals immediately highlighted its findings. Conservation organizations requested permission to visit. University departments proposed long-term collaborative studies. Within months, the Mercer Orchard officially became a living outdoor research laboratory where students, scientists, and growers could observe pollinator restoration functioning under real farming conditions. One quiet evening after the last research vehicle disappeared beyond the hills, Ethan walked slowly between rows of blooming pear trees. The cool air vibrated with thousands of wings moving from blossom to blossom. He opened his grandfather's old notebook once more. Beneath the faded sentence, "Healthy orchards don't begin with trees, they begin with healthy bees." He added one line of his own. "Healthy bees never thrive alone. They flourish when an entire community learns to protect them together." For more springs passed across Rogue Valley beneath soft gray skies and cool Pacific rains. Pear and apple blossoms drifted through the orchards like pale snow, while the steady hum of countless pollinators once again became the valley's most familiar sound. Time transformed the Mercer family orchard into something Ethan Mercer had never planned to build. What began as one young farmer's quiet attempt to restore forgotten beehives had grown into a destination visited by growers from across the American West. Every week, trucks carrying license plates from Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and California rolled slowly through the gravel entrance. Some visitors arrived carrying notebooks already filled with questions. Others carried old hive boxes in their truck beds, hoping Ethan could teach them how to restore what they had nearly burned. Many simply wanted to see whether the stories spreading through farming communities were truly possible. Ethan himself had changed very little. At 22 years old, he had grown broader through years of lifting hive boxes, building habitat fences, and working among orchards from sunrise until dusk. His dark hair remained untidy beneath the same weathered cap, though his once youthful face now carried the quiet confidence earned through experience rather than age. The gray-blue eyes that once searched only for answers now patiently searched for opportunities to help others find their own. Success had never made him enjoy attention. If anything, it reminded him of how much remained to learn. Every morning before visitors arrived, he still walked the orchard carrying his grandfather's notebook and listening to the familiar rhythm of bees waking with the sunrise. Behind the equipment shed, More than 100 restored hive boxes now stood beneath flowering hedgerows. Some contained thriving native pollinators. Others served as demonstration hives for visiting students. Several remained empty by design, waiting for future colonies rescued from construction sites or damaged habitats. Ethan refused to see them as equipment. To him, every hive represented another chance to rebuild a relationship between people and the land. Interest continued spreading faster than anyone expected. Local orchard associations noticed that growers restoring old hive equipment together spent far less money than those purchasing entirely new commercial systems every season. Neighboring farmers began exchanging and used hive boxes instead of throwing them away. Retired beekeepers donated decades of practical knowledge alongside forgotten tools. Small community workshops appeared throughout the valley where volunteers repaired weathered hive bodies, built replacement frames, and taught younger families how to care for local pollinators. Within 3 years, several fruit-growing associations across Oregon and Washington formally organized regional pollinator-sharing cooperatives. Instead of relying almost entirely on expensive imported colonies each spring, participating orchards coordinated the movement of healthy local colonies only when necessary, while investing far more effort into strengthening permanent pollinator habitats. Universities soon became part of the movement. Oregon State University expanded its research partnership. Washington State University joined shortly afterward. Agricultural extension offices began hosting restoration workshops using the Mercer Orchard as a practical training site rather than simply a research location. One autumn morning, another visitor arrived carrying neither cameras nor scientific equipment. Her name was Karen Whitmore. 54 years old, Karen possessed a tall, graceful posture shaped by decades of walking orchards rather than boardrooms. Short silver hair framed a composed face marked by gentle wrinkles earned through long years of outdoor work and difficult decisions. Calm blue eyes reflected the steady confidence of someone who preferred solving problems quietly instead of seeking recognition. As executive director of the Northwest Orchard Growers Association, Karen had spent nearly 30 years helping family farms survive changing markets, labor shortages, and environmental challenges. Practical without becoming cynical, she believed the strongest agricultural communities succeeded by sharing knowledge rather than guarding it. She spent an entire day walking beside Ethan without rushing a single conversation. Late that afternoon, she stopped beside one restored hive humming with native bees. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "most innovations make farming more expensive." Ethan smiled. "I never thought about innovation." Karen looked toward the orchard stretching across the hillside. "That's exactly why this works." Several months later, the association officially launched a regional program encouraging growers to restore abandoned hive equipment, establish flowering corridors, and exchange healthy local colonies instead of depending entirely upon outside suppliers. Participation exceeded every expectation. Hundreds of orchards volunteered during the first year alone. Economic reports gradually confirmed another unexpected benefit. Farmers adopting restoration practices significantly reduced the cost of renting commercial pollination services while increasing long-term colony stability. Local beekeepers discovered new income repairing and managing restored hives rather than constantly replacing lost equipment. Rural communities that had once watched pollinator numbers decline began recording steady recovery across surrounding landscapes. National media soon discovered the story. Television crews arrived from Portland, then Seattle, then California. Eventually, a national documentary crew followed Ethan through the orchard during peak bloom. Cameras captured thousands of native bees moving naturally between pear blossoms, while visitors quietly filled notebooks beneath flowering trees. When the documentary aired across the country, newspapers and television stations repeated the same nickname: the young farmer who brought the bees home. Ethan never asked for the title. He rarely mentioned it. Instead, he continued repairing old hive boxes each winter exactly as he had years earlier. One cool April afternoon, Harold Benson parked beside the workshop carrying 2 weathered hive boxes in the back of his pickup. He smiled awkwardly. "Found these behind my grandfather's barn." Ethan recognized them immediately. "They're old." Harold nodded. "So was your idea." For a moment, both men laughed. Harold looked toward the growing line of visitors waiting for the afternoon orchard tour. "Funny thing." "What's that?" I remember when folks laughed because you were collecting junk. He watched another bus pull into the parking area. Now they're booking 6 months ahead just to learn how you did it. Ethan looked across the orchard where thousands of bees drifted peacefully through blooming trees. He quietly closed his grandfather's notebook. The valley had finally remembered something it had almost forgotten. Sometimes, the future of farming begins by saving what everyone else believes no longer has value. 7 years passed beneath the familiar gray skies of Oregon's Rogue Valley. Every spring the orchards awakened beneath drifting rain, blooming pear trees, and the steady chorus of thousands of wings moving from blossom to blossom. What had once sounded unusual had become the valley's heartbeat once again. Visitors often stopped in silence before entering the Mercer orchard, surprised that the loudest sound was no longer tractors or machinery, but life itself returning to the land. Ethan Mercer was 29 now. The quiet teenager who once drove across the valley collecting abandoned hive boxes had become a respected orchard steward, though almost nothing about his daily routine had changed. His shoulders had grown broader through years of lifting hive bodies and planting flowering hedgerows, while faint lines now surrounded the gray-blue eyes that still examined every blossom before sunrise. His dark hair remained untidy beneath the same faded canvas cap, and his hands carried even more scars from chisels, cedar boards, smokers, and pruning knives. Success had never changed his personality. He still preferred listening to bees over listening to applause. Every morning began exactly as it had years earlier, with a slow walk through the orchard carrying his grandfather's leather notebook before greeting a single visitor. By then, the Community Pollinator Recovery Network had expanded far beyond Rogue Valley. More than 900 orchards across Oregon, Washington, Idaho, California, and parts of Montana participated in the growing partnership. Thousands of restored hive boxes once destined for burn piles now sheltered thriving native pollinators. Regional farming cooperatives shared queen-rearing knowledge, flowering habitat plans, disease monitoring records, and restoration techniques instead of competing against one another. Native bee populations that had once declined year after year were now steadily recovering across many participating landscapes. Independent agricultural reports revealed encouraging changes. Fruit set improved throughout numerous pear and apple growing regions. Growers spent significantly less renting imported commercial pollination colonies. Flowering corridors connected neighboring farms into larger pollinator habitats. Birds, butterflies, solitary bees, bumblebees, and countless beneficial insects appeared in places where they had become increasingly rare only a decade earlier. The movement no longer belonged to Ethan. It belonged to an entire farming community. Universities continued expanding their research partnerships. Graduate students completed dissertations using long-term data collected from participating orchards. Conservation organizations documented the return of several native bee species to restored habitats. Even state agricultural agencies began recommending habitat restoration alongside conventional orchard management practices. One warm May afternoon, another visitor arrived at the Mercer orchard. His name was Thomas Granger. 60 years old, Thomas possessed a lean frame shaped by decades of walking rural communities rather than working behind office desks. His neatly combed silver hair rested above thoughtful brown eyes that reflected quiet curiosity instead of urgency. Fine wrinkles surrounded his face from years spent outdoors interviewing ordinary people whose lives rarely appeared in headlines. As a senior correspondent for a nationally respected documentary series focused on rural America, Thomas believed the country's greatest stories were often hidden inside communities that quietly solved problems without seeking attention. Patient, humble, and deeply observant, he preferred allowing silence to reveal character before asking difficult questions. Rather than beginning with cameras, Thomas spent 2 days simply walking beside Ethan. He watched volunteers repairing old hive boxes. He observed children planting native flowers beside orchard rows. He listened as retired beekeepers taught young farmers how to recognize healthy queens. Only on the third afternoon did he finally ask the question he had carried throughout the visit. They stood together inside the old wooden workshop where everything had first begun. Above the restored workbench now hung a beautifully carved cedar sign. Its familiar words had been carefully engraved by David Mercer during the previous winter. Healthy orchards don't begin with trees, they begin with healthy bees. Thomas studied the sign quietly. I've interviewed people who built million-dollar companies, he said softly. I've interviewed famous scientists and government leaders. He turned toward Ethan. But I think people will remember this workshop longer than most of them. Ethan smiled modestly. My grandfather would probably laugh if he heard that. Thomas looked toward the old notebook resting on the bench. What is the most valuable thing he ever gave you? Ethan never looked away from the carved words. He never taught me how to raise more bees. A gentle smile crossed his face. He taught me how to stop giving up on the ones we already had. Thomas lowered his notebook. Neither man spoke again for several moments. No further explanation seemed necessary. Months later, the documentary aired nationwide. It never focused on technology. It never celebrated Ethan as a hero. Instead, it told the story of forgotten hive boxes, patient restoration, and ordinary people choosing to protect what still remained instead of replacing everything that appeared broken. Years continued passing. Children who had once visited the Mercer orchard on school field trips eventually returned as orchard managers, conservation biologists, and beekeepers themselves. Many brought with them weathered hive boxes discovered inside grandparents' barns. Few people could even remember the time when those old wooden hives had been stacked beside roads waiting to be burned. What they remembered instead was something far more important. A quiet young farmer who refused to measure value by appearance. Someone who looked beyond cracked wood and empty boxes. Someone who believed nature rarely needed people to invent entirely new answers. Sometimes, it simply needed someone willing to restore the answers it had almost forgotten. And from those abandoned hives, a living network of pollinators returned. Hundreds of orchards flourished again. Entire communities rediscovered the strength of working with nature rather than against it. The old hive boxes never changed the world by themselves. They simply reminded people that hope often begins when someone chooses to rescue what everyone else is ready to abandon. Sometimes, God's greatest miracles do not begin with something new. Sometimes, they begin with something the world has forgotten. An old beehive, a worn notebook, a quiet young man willing to believe that what seemed broken could still have a purpose. While many people looked for faster and more expensive solutions, God placed a different answer in Ethan's path, one built on patience, stewardship, and respect for the life he had already created. And when Ethan chose to care for those forgotten bees instead of giving up on them, he discovered that restoring creation can become a miracle of its own. Perhaps the same is true in our lives. We all know someone who feels overlooked, someone carrying silent burdens, or perhaps we ourselves have begun to believe that it's too late to start again. But God often works through the things the world overlooks. A small act of kindness, a word of encouragement, a second chance, a seed of hope planted today may become tomorrow's blessing for an entire community. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need a little hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, or share a moment when something others had given up on became a blessing in your life. And if you enjoy inspiring stories about faith, nature, compassion, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, please subscribe to the channel and join our growing community. May God bless you, bless your family, fill your home with peace, guide your steps with wisdom, and remind you every day that no act of love, no act of kindness, and no life He created is ever truly without purpose. God bless you all.